Hello, and welcome to the third part of the Secondary Data Lecture Series. I'm your host, Chris Curran, and in this part of the series, we'll talk a little bit about examples of data and apply some of the terms we learned in Part 1 and Part 2 to those examples. Just as a bit of a review, in the last video, we distinguished between different types of data, whether it be cross-sectional or longitudinal, where cross-sectional data meant data that is a single snapshot in time, and longitudinal represented data that took place over time. Within longitudinal, we distinguish between three types of longitudinal data. Panel data, which followed the same individuals over time. Pooled cross-sectional data, also called cohort data, which followed different time periods but different individuals at each time period. Or time series data, which was a single aggregate snapshot at each time point. In this video, we're going to look at two examples of real data sets collected by the National Center of Education Statistics and use these terms, these categorizations, to describe the data sets. So let's jump to the first example. Our first example comes from the Schools and Staffing Survey, which is a national survey that's collected on principals and schools periodically over time. So here we have a short excerpt from the National Center of Education Statistics that describes the SAS. And so what I'd recommend you doing right now is actually pausing the video, taking a moment to read through this description, and then I'd like you to try to categorize this data set as either cross-sectional or longitudinal, and then if longitudinal, apply either the panel, cohort, or time series categorizations to the data set. So again, just take a moment, pause your video right now, work through this example, and then we'll come back and discuss after you've had a moment to process it. Okay, so hopefully as you read through the SAS, it became apparent to you that this data is longitudinal cohort data. Now it's longitudinal data because it takes place over time. So as the description tells us, this data has been collected at various time points between 1987 and present. It is, however, cohort data rather than panel data because at each time point, it's a different set of individuals. In other words, it's not following the same principals, the same teachers, the same schools over time. Instead, it's a series of cross-sections, which is why we might also call this the pooled cross-section data set, at various points in time. All right, now, you might be wondering, well, wait a second, what if I only looked at a single administration of the SAS? Well, if you were to say only pull the 1987 version of the SAS, then in fact you might describe your analysis as cross-sectional because you would only be using that single snapshot. But if you used all of the SAS collections, all of the waves of the SAS, we could think of it as longitudinal cohort data. So it is important to distinguish sometimes, even within a longitudinal data set, an individual researcher's analyses might be using a cross-sectional part of the data set. We'll see, I think, again, some of that in some of our future examples. So let's jump then to example number 2. Example number 2 also comes from the National Center of Education Statistics. And in this example, we're looking at the National Education Longitudinal Study of 1988. So just as before, we have an excerpt from NCES on the nature of this research survey study. So as before, go ahead and take a moment to pause your video, work through this example, again with the idea of distinguishing whether it's cross-sectional or longitudinal data, and if longitudinal, whether it's panel, cohort, or time series data. All right, so you've had a moment to work through this example. Hopefully you came to the conclusion that this is longitudinal panel data. So as the description describes, we have data collected beginning in 1988, but collected again in 1990, 92, 94, and 2000. So there is a time aspect to this. It's longitudinal in nature. This data is panel data, however, because it's following the same individuals. So as it describes, it takes a set of 8th graders in 1988, but then follows up with these 8th graders as they move into high school, college, and so forth. So because it follows the same individuals, it is panel data rather than cohort data. Now, just as I mentioned with the SAS, where longitudinal data could be used cross-sectionally, we can say the same thing about the NCES. So it's possible for a researcher to take this data set and only look at the 1988 year, the year where the students were in 8th grade. If that was the case, then even though this is a longitudinal data set, we might properly describe the research study as using cross-sectional data because the researcher has chosen to only look at a cross-section of the broader data set. So again, sometimes we may distinguish the terms used whether we're describing the data set itself or whether we're describing the actual analyses and the part of the data set that an individual researcher chooses to examine for the purpose of their study. But again, if we're thinking about the NELs broadly, longitudinal panel data is the proper description. All right, so in this video, we worked through a couple of examples of applying these terms of temporality to describing data sets. In part 4, we're going to think more about where to actually find the data. It's great that we have all these terms, but when it comes to actually analyzing and running a study, where can we find secondary data? So in part 4, we'll look at a few examples of extant data sets that we can find publicly available for analysis. So I thank you for joining for this part of the lecture series and look forward to having you join in future ones.